All right, here we are back again on one day of the week. It's bound to be one of them. Look at this. Nothing on the cup. Oh my God. Not to worry. Here's this beautiful portrait of Mozart. Oh, look at him there with his big nose. Oh, it's so funny. And his periwig. And yeah, it's beautiful. And that's what takes pride of place on this cup. It's kind of bizarre because you start to sort of like if the other person's supposed to get the benefit of it, you'd have to point it at them, and you don't get the benefit of it because you can just see the back of his hair. If you're drinking this way, if you're drinking this way, you can see the tip of his nose. But it's a beautiful mug, and the artist is Richard Thompson, who did a wonderful comic strip called Cul-de-sac. He was also an illustrator, a very talented, very whimsical, charming guy. The strip Cul-de-sac has two children. It's about a family, and the mother is this wonderful sort of, just sort of completely unpredictable character, and the father is this little light bulb. Sort of has a little light bulb for a head. He's got his little. And he gets into squeezes in with a little tiny car every day, and he goes off to work, and then he gets out of the car, and he gets to be normal size. The car is a little tiny car, and the two children are really the children are really the center of the strip. So Petey is the older child; he's the boy, and he's probably I don't know. I suppose he's supposed to be 9 or 10, and he's completely neurotic. He's agoraphobic, and he wants completely control his environment. And his favorite comic strip is a comic strip called Little Nero, which is actually Little Nemo, which I've mentioned before here. As I say, so take notes, there'll be a quiz. And he pays obsessive attention to the panels. If you're an obsessive compulsive, I think Little Nemo is the strip for you. Although the lettering in the word balloons would drive you nuts, because it's the one thing McKay didn't bother with. He just he did the lettering, but he always ran over, and so the letters would always have to curl around on the word balloons. Anyway, it's for another day. And his sister Alice could not be more different. She's extroverted. She's crazy. She's got no, as Bill Watterson said about the two children, Petey is all filter and Alice is no filter, and that's true. Anyway. So this artist, Richard Thompson, is the same guy who did Cul-de-sac. He very sadly died about 2 years ago now. But they're just charming, beautiful strips, and he hit his stride, and he just was doing this gorgeous work, and then he got sick and died. So anyway. Let's raise a glass of tea. If you're Russian, you would be raising a glass of tea. So to all the Russians out there, may you raise a glass of tea with a piece of rock sugar in your mouth that you would drink the tea through. And to others who are not Russian, like me, to Richard Thompson, a great artist and somebody who has made our lives indubitably better, as Daffy Duck would say. Indubitably. Actually, I guess as Porky would say that. Well, Daffy might say it too. So today, I'm going to talk about really one film, but I'm going to show you this set. I don't think this set is being made anymore like this. I don't know. It's probably 2 Blu-rays now, but it's a Criterion and Criterion. You can subscribe to the Criterion channel. Some of you may be subscribed to the channel. It sort of subscribes you to the best of European art house cinema from. Really, the concentration is from the 1950s onward, well, from the 40s, I guess, onward, with a number of sort of hits from the 20s and 30s. But but really, so they have, you know, the whole of Kurosawa's oeuvre, and they have a lot of many Japanese directors. Ozu, oh man, a whole bunch of just a whole bunch of people. Okay, my mind is of course conveniently gone blank. It's like, dude, your mind is like, oh look, he's going to ask for us. Let's leave. Let's go and get some smokes. And off your mind goes to the corner to get some smokes. Anyway, mine doesn't even. Well, I don't think it smokes, but who knows? Fume pas, défense de fumer. Anyway, so this is a duology of Yojimbo and Sanjuro. And Kurosawa made, I can't remember, 45, 50 films, some astonishing number of films. And his best films are arguably the ones with Toshiro Mifune in them, who was considered to be a national treasure in Japan. So was Kurosawa. Once the relationship between them broke up, Kurosawa had to find other people who could play the Mifune role, basically. But Mifune was lower class, and as far as I remember, he was not trained as an actor, which was, of course, a no-no. I mean, it was acting is a recognizable skill. I mean, and it was something that people said they were, like this was their job, and it wasn't like the West, where to be an actor meant you were sort of probably also a thief, or, you know, if you were a female actor. Well, there weren't female actors initially in Japan, but if a woman went onto the stage in Japan, it didn't mean she was a prostitute, which it sort of pretty much did. The assumption was that a woman, there was like acting and then prostitution. In the West. Anyway, that's a thing. So the first film, Yojimbo, is and they've done a really nice job here. I mean, they've got the pattern of the mon, the heraldic crest, which they've made up here. So it's this. It's usually some kind of organic form with some other meaningful sign inside it, which is like they're heraldic crests, and they usually are about balance, and they're related to nature, and it's a very complex, beautiful, gorgeous sign system. But this one has two crossed pistols, because Yojimbo is about the moment in Japanese history when basically gunpowder re-enters the picture, because the Japanese forbade the gun, and Noel Parent says they gave up the gun for centuries so that they could go back to sort of a noble way of warfare. It's another whole story. Anyway, Yojimbo and Sanjuro, which is the second film. Yojimbo is an astonishing movie. Why? Let's see if we have. They've so tried to get this right. Like they've aged the would it be a scroll, you know, so that it's like, yeah. So this crest is then repeated on what would have been printed on the not the obi, but the jeez, that's it. I've lost it. The garment that they wore, and you'll see Toshiro Mifune here with his. It typically pulls his arms back down into his. I want to call it a gi, but that's not right. It'll come to me. My sister will be saying there, sitting there going, "It's it, Tim. It's it." Yeah, I know. I get it. And it would have been, well, the wealthy. It's not an obi. Oh, for Christ's sakes! It's the traditional wear of well, everybody wore them. Oh, man. Can't remember. It'll come to me. This thing is all designed. It's beautifully designed. That's the point. Yojimbo is the Japanese word for bodyguard. And we never know the character's name. He gives his name at one point in Yojimbo. I can't remember what it is. In Shanzuro I remember, but in Yojimbo, at some point somebody asks his name, and he looks out the sort of doorway of the house, or they're sitting in a bar or something like that, a tavern, and he says he sees a tree or something like that, and he says, I'm ginkgo or something. I can't remember. He gives a name which is basically a nature, some kind of nature. And in Sanjuro, which is essentially another film that because the character was so popular, they're like, oh, bring him back. So they did. And it is a very charming movie. At some point they say to him, what's your name? And he says, and he's sitting on these houses are raised, and but they're open to the air, right? I mean, it's a tough culture. There are these charcoal braziers. The doors are otherwise open. You're sitting there with your piece of clothing on. So this is gonna, and that's it. It's like, oh, it's cold. So they're tough, and they're just used to being cold. So he looks out and he says, Mulberry Wheatfield, because he's looking at a wheat field. So he says, he gives his name as Mulberry Wheatfield, and that's what they have to call him after that. So you never know his name. And he arrives in the first town, and this is a repeating theme for Kurosawa, who very often made films about class. Almost every single film that Kurosawa made was either about class or, well, it was probably about class. It was probably also about a lot of other things. But if it was the upper class, it was basically how crazy they were, particularly royalty. So, that's why he does Macbeth, Throne of Blood. He does King Lear, Ran, R.A.N., which is one of the most gorgeous films you are ever going to see. Kurosawa himself was a samurai. He came from the samurai class. And these are the warriors, counselors, who are the upper caste soldiers, but really they're the professional soldiers who are also leading families, and they're extremely powerful, and they all pledge allegiance basically to a lord, and so to be a samurai, and if your lord dies and leaves you masterless, or your lord is shamed and you become masterless, you become a masterless samurai, you become a ronin, R-O-N-I-N, which I'll maybe talk about. Because, it's a famous figure. And the idea of the sort of loose, the gun for hire, or in this case, the sword for hire, is incredibly popular in the East, and is incredibly popular in the West. And so it's the West, and the East. So there's this connection in before the war and then after the war, between the Western, which the Japanese loved. The Japanese loved Westerns, and they identified with them. And so they began to make what the West calls Eastern Westerns. So they began to make Chanbara films, which are basically films about something's wrong with the lord. Something's wrong in the household, which often one of these castles or a great house. And the lords pledge their allegiance to the super lord, right? the shogun, and they support the shogun. The whole thing is basically corrupt because the peasants are then at the mercy of these local warlords who can starve them, can tax them, can take their rice and trade their rice. So you can be working and starving, basically. And that brings about a peasant revolt. This is the whole. So in this particular, that's sort of the background. So in this particular story, Yojimbo, and we'll just call him Yojimbo because that's basically how he gets to be known. Although it's like calling a character Gunfighter, and the Gunfighter, which we do. I mean, that's where Stephen King gets this character from. I mean, he gets the character from the sort of there must be a champion, an eternal champion. The eternal champion, the idea of the eternal champion, was discussed, was refined, and discussed the most clearly, whether or not it's accurate, by Joseph Campbell in the middle of the 20th century, a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he basically looks at hero literature from around the world and identifies similar markers that, this is what makes a hero. And a lot of it's very accurate. I mean, a lot of it's a very interesting book. It's structuralist in the sense that we won't get into that. Anyway, so Yojimbo, bodyguard, arrives in this little town. And the town is divided between two corrupt families, both of whom try to own the town. One of the families makes silk, and the other family... I can't remember. I can't remember what the other family does. But they both control trade, and the families and they're feuding, these two clans. So it's enormously dangerous to live in this town. But at the same time, they're making money. So it's reasonable if you're a peasant, as most people were. I mean, there are very few lords and mostly peasants. True everywhere, right? So this is another discussion of class. Now, it's a discussion of class, and this is always interesting, in the post-war period, where we have to look at what was Kurosawa doing, making films about masterless samurai, who came into corrupt, crooked situations and fixed them. And so the discussion of class is then layered over, it has to be layered over, by the cultural context, which is that Japan has lost the war and has been invaded, probably really has been invaded by the Americans who are occupying Japan and who are breaking the grip of the monarchy and bringing about capitalism on the home islands in the midst of a traditional way of life and the rush to modernity and all of those things. So in the middle of that, here's this discussion of basically honor and what is the code of the warrior's code. Now, warrior here has a lot of dense meanings. In the same way that if you think about warrior samurai in the East, you need to put it together with the gunfighters that we sort of know and love from the West. So John Wayne, Clint Eastwood. Now, Clint Eastwood is the most clear inheritor of this particular tradition, and he really used it. There would have been Gary Cooper, and to some extent Jimmy Stewart, who occasionally played those. I mean, later on, but basically good guys, white hats who did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. And so the Western is a relatively simple narrative where the gunfighter arrives in a stricken town, which is run by the corrupt sheriff is in league with a rancher, and who's not a jolly rancher, and between them they've got the town terrified, and then the one white hat arrives basically and appeals to the best in the citizenry, but has to lead. And basically the way that works is that when the White Knight arrives, he, and it's almost always he, well, actually it's always he, up until a certain point, like the 70s, when he arrives, he sets things right, and then very often leaves because he goes on to the next town. Okay, so, all right. So in this Eastern Western, because Kurosawa liked Westerns, he writes this very smart story. And the story is so smart that it has been made and made and made, and it continues to be a charming, funny, well worked out. The mechanics of the story are just so good. It's just one of those stories that the structure of the story is a piece of genius. So Yojimbo comes into town, and one family tries to hire him, and he takes their money, and he tries to. They just want a hired sword because they don't have guns, right? They have katana, the samurai sword, and so he's in with them, and then he moseys on down the road to the other clan to see how they're doing, and they want to hire him. So he charges them more money, and he takes their money. And in the whole process, the character begins to amass more and more money, but he starts off really small. And it's like a slow moving, you got to take your time, and you can take this, it's going to be a joy. It's such a pleasure to watch this movie, just to see it unfold, to see Toshiro Mifune do his thing. He's a laconic, slow talking, he's funny. I mean, the character is like, he just isn't thrown by anything. He starts off in the bar, and the bartender, sort of tavern keeper, really, is an incredibly important figure in every iteration of this story. The bar owner, the bar is sort of a neutral territory. So Yojimbo often winds up in that place. And in the place, usually he finds the sheriff, who has given up and is variously bitter, beaten. The sheriff is a good guy, but he's weak. Basically, he doesn't have the stuff. He's not, he's he's not a champion. That's the point. You have to have a champion. So Yojimbo starts to get the lay of the land, so to speak, from this sheriff who says, okay, on this side we've got this family, on the other side we've got this family, and they say this has happened and they won't do this, and they say this has happened and they won't do that, and one of they're both corrupt, and one of the families is run essentially by a matriarch who is sort of always shown to be shrill, and another family is run by this super macho idiot. So and so each one of them, each family has their own sort of peculiarities, but they're full of corrupt thieves and psychopaths. There's always a psychopathic killer. So Yojimbo goes to the other family, and they're like, "Whoa, you were hired by us. We'll pay you more." So they pay him more. Okay, so he's with them, and he sees that the people in the town are suffering the most, of course, because the poor are always the ones who take it for the rich, right? And this is the point about so many of these films by Kurosawa, is that he points out how it is the small people who always suffer. Now, he also argues in Seven Samurai, which I'll talk about in a couple of days, that the farmers also control things. And this is a really interesting point of view. I mean, he really, and especially as a samurai in the samurai class himself, he obviously was ambivalent about this whole thing. At the same time, he made two of the most affecting movies about poverty. The Lower Depths, which is, these people who are they're astonishing. I mean, they're basically spend their time with a little tiny amount of money they have. They gamble and they drink, and that's kind of it. And Dodesca Den. And Dodesca Den is one of the most heartbreaking, astonishing, dark, oh God, movies you will ever see about the poor in a city, basically. And Dodesca Den, the title comes from the sound that the streetcar makes, according to the child. There's a child who is, I can't remember whether he's got Down syndrome. I can't remember what he's supposed to be, but basically the child is, he's what in the South they would call a child of God. You know, he sees things clearly, sort of, but he's kind of not there. Anyway, it's typical. And he's taken care of by a guy on the street who looks after him. And there's these are withering portraits of poverty, in, you know, where there clearly there are people who have way too much and there are people who have nothing at all. In the lower depths, they actually live in a rubbish tip, as the British would call it. So my memory is that the first thing you see is somebody coming from the upper city, basically, and emptying out, you know, tipping up the wagon, and the garbage sort of runs down, and then the camera goes down, and there are these people living there in shelters. It's truly amazing. Anyway, so this is always an issue for Kurosawa. So in Yojimbo, we've got this character who begins to see that to help the people in the town, he's got to play these two families off against each other. So he begins to work them, and they say they want to fight each other, so, you know, he sets up a fight, and they can't actually fight each other. There's one guy who has a gun, and slowly Yojimbo begins to work it so that he steals something from one of the families and plants it in the other family, and, you know, he engineers basically the destruction of the two families. And it's very clever, because of course they don't know what he's doing, and they trust him because they think he's just a hired hand, and he's just this guy who blows in from nowhere, right? That's the point. He's this man with no name, which should ring a bell. Okay. So that's sort of the story of Yojimbo, but it's the mechanics of the going back and forth, and it has this particular set of beats, you know, where this happens and then that happens. And at some point, he's, as always sort of happens with the White Knight, you know, he has to get beaten up. I mean, he has to show that, you know, he can take a beating and come back from it, so he does get beaten up. And then at one point, he becomes friends with the coffin maker, who's doing great business, of course. This is the same thing in their versions of this. And Japanese coffins are like, at the time, they were like tubs. They were sort of like barrels. So they would bury the person sitting up. And so at one point he gets the coffin maker he gets in the coffin, and I think he wants to disappear, basically, so he can see what's going to happen while he's, you know, let it play out. And so he needs to cross the street without being seen. So he gets in the coffin, and he has two guys carry his coffin across, and he lifts the lid, you know, and he looks out. And so it's a clever scene. So there's a whole bunch of really sweet, sort of funny, charming. It's an old-fashioned adventure movie, basically, and it's all set within this. But it's a game. It's a psychological game, you know, basically, where he's gaming these two entities, and he slowly keeps on collecting more and more money from them, and you know it's not going to end well, and for them, and then he leaves town. You know why? He fixes the problem. And now, what's interesting about this is that it was very quickly remade as A Fistful of Dollars by Sergio Leone. Now, so here's this weird thing, right? So it wasn't just remade as a Western, but it was remade as a spaghetti Western. so-called because the Italians shot westerns in Italy or in Spain, depending on the. They had lots of land that sort of looked like the West, sort of looked like the West. It was desert and people could ride horses, so they had people ride around, and so there were the so-called spaghetti westerns. And Sergio Leone, an Italian, made some of the most famous spaghetti westerns that you may or may not have seen. If you haven't seen them, you're in for a treat. So Fistful of Dollars, then For a Few Dollars More. And then the third film in that series is, they just call it the Dollars Trilogy. I guess they call the third one The Man with No Name. That doesn't sound right. Hang on a second. I'm sure I have it here. Just call it. Oh, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Okay. Yeah. All right. So they say the third film is this one, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But it isn't really. It's just that it's The Man with No Name. So basically, what Leone does. So this is the. So this is For a Few Dollars More. So this is okay. So what's going on here is that Leone gets interested in this character, this Man with No Name character, who appears and sets things right and doesn't appear to have any stake in it except that. But the character is the most intelligent, although he's completely underestimated by all parties, but helped by the people who can help him, the weak usually. And this idea of the Man with No Name who just does what we all hope we would do, kind of thing, and is talented and sort of is almost magical. He disappears when he's going to be shot, but he's not there. There's always sort of happens. The characters like there's a gunshot from nowhere, and then turn around and you think the bad guy's got him dead to rights. No. So that's this character. That comes from Kurosawa's Ronin Yojimbo, the bodyguard. And he reappears. So this Yojimbo is then remade as Fistful of Dollars, which is the same story without really any modifications, except that it's set in Mexico. And the Man with No Name is Clint Eastwood, and he uses guns. But he also basically gets over on the two families, the Rojas and I can't remember the other name of the family. And, it's just disaster happening today. It's all over the place. And he fixes things. In Sanjuro, which is the second film that has the same character, Mulberry Wheatfield, who appears. There was a Man with No Name. There's the same kind of. It's clever. I mean, the movies are clever. They're action films, but they're clever about it. And that wasn't immediately remade in the same way. But the idea took hold. And so Fistful of Dollars was then remade as Last Man Standing, which is the very same story. So Walter Hill, who was a famous Western actor, and then that is an actor in Westerns, and then a director of action movies. Same generation as Sam Peckinpah. He made things like The Warriors. He made a bunch of Westerns. He made The Warriors. He directed Streets of Fire. He directed a whole bunch of stuff. And he's a good filmmaker. I mean, he made Extreme Prejudice, not one of the better Westerns. But he did make some good Westerns. I just read one of his graphic novel by Walter Hill, actually. He's the guy who put money into producing Aliens for James Cameron, and I think probably made his. I think he probably was fine after that. Didn't need any extra. So the movie has been made and passed back and forth between the East and the West, and it just keeps on going. And it's just a charming, wonderful, good-natured. The heroes win, and they're clever, and then so you could see this one. So what I recommend is, see this one and then see Fistful of Dollars, because it's such a blast to see, this, which is set in basically, Restoration era Japan. Well, no. Yeah, I guess that's right. In 19th century Japan. And then see the Western, which is a spaghetti Western made in Italy with one American in it. Actually, a few Americans, people who would go on to be Clint Eastwood's people. And starts the character with a man with no name who will reappear for a few dollars more. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. High Plains Drifter. High Plains Drifter, perhaps one of the purest evocations of this character. Existential. The closest thing, I think, that anybody got to understanding what was at the heart of this samurai, this disenfranchised samurai Ronin, who had been loosed on the world. And with that, I leave you to viewing pleasure, as they used to say, for your viewing pleasure. But it really is viewing pleasure.